Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint a bird in acrylics. Now the first thing that I want to do here is start off with my background. Now I had a specific aim for this tutorial and I want to complete the bird with one brush. For the background though, that of course would have taken too long, so I am using just a standard 1-inch flat brush, and then I'm using a soft blending brush. This is just a makeup brush to really do some wet and wet blending and get that nice smooth transition. Now blending with acrylics can be frustrating. It's all about the layering process and keeping that paint wet for as long as required. So you can see here that I'm actually using my airbrush to apply water with a light mist over the top, but you could use a fine mist spray bottle as well. Now if you would like to see any of the sections of this tutorial in real time, then that's all available on my Patreon channel. So the blending of the acrylics in the background there are no sections sped up or cut out, and I'll link my Patreon in the description below if that's of interest. Now when it came to painting the bird, this again here is where I've decided to use one brush from start to finish. Now the reasoning behind this was I wanted to create a tutorial that was perfect for any artist new to acrylics, and I thought what better way of doing that but limiting the amount of brushes that we're using, because quite often we'll have 10, 20, 30, sometimes more brushes in front of us and we never use them. I know for a fact that I've got many brushes here and I probably only use 4 or 5. But even if we're using a range of brushes, if we're not using good brush technique, we're not going to be able to get the most out of that brush. So this tutorial here is going to be perfect for really refining those skills. Now this tutorial on Patreon is available with a voiceover while I'm painting, so that means that no process is rushed through. I explain everything thoroughly. Now at this stage where I'm blocking in my base layer, I'm still paying very close attention to my reference photo. Regardless if I'm using different brushes or different animals that I'm painting, I will always work in small sections and make sure that I've got my base layer as accurate as I can. You can see here that I'm still hinting at my lights, midtones and my shadows. Now with this brush here, this is very much going to focus on the way that we're holding the brush, how we should move the brush, how much pressure we should be applying to the brush, and also how much paint should be loaded to the brush. All of these main things massively affect the sort of brushstrokes that we create, and this is why I'm so excited about this tutorial. As you can see here, with lighter pressure, it makes this look like I'm now adding these details with these tinier feathers with maybe something like a small liner brush. But as long as we're adjusting how we're using that brush, this worked perfectly fine. There wasn't any one occasion where I was painting this and I felt, oh, I really wish I could grab one of my liner brushes. Once I was in that moment and adjusting how I was holding and using this brush, it worked perfectly from those first base layers all the way to the final details. Now as we work through this bird here, you're going to see that those details are going to get finer and even more delicate, and this again is all based on how much pressure we're applying to the brush. Now regardless of the brush technique, the layering process is also important. So you can see here that for the most part I am working from dark to light. And when I work with acrylics, this is my go-to method. This enables me to focus on my values. Now when I talk about values, I'm meaning my lights and my darks. So if I've got a particularly dark section, I want to be making sure that I've captured that in my painting. If your shadows are too bright, you're not going to have that three-dimensional look in your finished painting. So it doesn't really matter what brushes I'm using here. If the contrast of my painting is not right and the values are off, my painting will look very flat and two-dimensional when finished. So if you've seen many of my other tutorials here on YouTube, you'll know that I put so much focus on contrast and value because I really do think that that's what makes our paintings look realistic. Now as I start building up my layers here, you can really see how the first few layers don't look great. My main aim is purely just to block out that background colour. You can see the very first layer on the actual body of the bird, it looks quite sketchy. You can see my brush strokes. That there is what I want to cover up. Once I've got more of a smoother looking layer with my colours more blended, that's when I can start focusing on my details. Now something else that will affect the brushstrokes is the scale of the painting that we're working on. This is actually quite small, it's only a 5x7-inch canvas board, but I deliberately picked this size because I wanted to really scale everything down so that we could focus just using that one brush. Sometimes working on a smaller scale is often avoided because we don't feel like we can add the same amount of detail, which although is true to some extent because the larger the painting, the more room we have to add more brush strokes, But with this, you can see that there is so much depth that we can still build up here as long as we're using good brush technique. You can see from the photo in the corner of my finished painting just how much detail and photorealism I was able to get on such a small scale. Now, along with focusing on the brush technique, the layering process is also important. You can see here that in a moment the colour's going to change, and that's because I'm using the use of a glaze. So here I've just put a little bit of a warmer brown over the top. You do want to make sure that when you're working with glazes that the layer underneath is completely dry, because that glaze, which is thinner, is going to then mix in with that paint that is wet underneath, and the glaze won't work in the same way. Now, if you're applying your details on top, as I am here, you don't necessarily have to wait for that glaze to dry. You can if you want to, but it is important to make sure that whatever's underneath your glaze is completely dry. As I'm building up my layers here, again, I'm going to adjust that colour with another use of a glaze. Now, glazes is something that I get asked quite frequently here on YouTube, and whether or not I use any glazing mediums. I personally just thin my paint down with water, and you do want it fairly thin so that you can still see the details and layers underneath. If you're working with a glaze and you feel that it's covered the layer, that's because the mixture is too thick. You want to add more water or glazing medium, whatever is your preference, and then get that a little bit more transparent. Now, as I'm continuing to build my layers here, you can see just how important the contrast and values are. Each layer I'm adding is helping to add more depth to the feathers. I'm also paying very close attention to the position of my highlights and shadows. So the feathers on the top nearest the neck, where the chest is more puffed up, that there is going to catch more of the light, whereas lower down towards the feet, that part of the body is going to be in shadow. So I have to be making sure that I've captured that. By positioning my highlights and shadows like this accurately, I'm helping to follow the three-dimensional shape of that bird. If the highlights and shadows are changed in their placement, we will change the structure of that animal. Now, this is obviously very, very important because we want to be trying to replicate the emotion, the structure, exactly what that animal looks like from that reference photo we're working from. Now, if you're working pet portrait, that there is obviously so important. The owner of that pet is going to know if the shape of that animal's face is not right. Now, you could have your proportions and perspective fine, but if you've got your highlights and shadows in the wrong place, that can make the face look different. So it's something to pay very, very close attention to. Now, moving on to the branch, this is where my main aim was to make sure that I used the same brush, but to get a different texture. The feathers needed to have a bit more of that softer appearance, but with the bark on here, I wanted to be making sure that although the painting is flat, so you can't get any texture, physical texture if you were to run your fingers over it, it looks like there should be. And this is all about adjusting the brush technique. However, before I get to that, I want to be blocking out that background colour, and I want to be building up my lights and my darks. So although this is a branch, this is exactly the same method that I have used for the feathers and the bird itself. You can see here that now once those first two base layers have dried, I can start to hint at my light source. Now, the light source of any photograph is really, really important. If you are working from a reference photo where you've got an animal in a tree, sometimes the branches are going to have what looks like multiple light sources, and that's because the light can be bouncing off of the trunk and then catching different branches in different ways. So that there is going to be one exception. But you can see here that the light source on the branch is on the left hand side, the bird is cast in the shadow in the center, and then there's a little bit more of a highlight to the right hand side of the foot. But all of this here is something to pay very close attention to. And the reason why I like working with glazes is because I can focus on my values, and in this instance building up the texture of the bark, but I don't have to worry about mixing the exact colour for the paint at each layer at the same time. I can do that at a completely different process later on. So if you do find yourself getting a little bit stressed and uptight about colour mixing and worrying about which colours you should be using at each layer, then the use of glazes like this can really help. So I do hope that this tutorial has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. As I've mentioned, if you would like to paint along to the real-time version of this tutorial, then it is available on my Patreon now, and you do get the reference photo liner and full material list. If you've got any questions about Patreon, then feel free to pop them in the comments below, along with any other art related questions. I'm more than happy to help if I can. The one thing that I will mention quickly about Patreon is it's very flexible, so you can stay for as long as you want or you can cancel at any time. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube in the next few days, but as always, thank you so much for watching.